Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Thrilled to be back on CityTalk, here from a very steamy Toronto. I don't know where you're all coming in from, but one of the things we ask you to do, first of all, is to just acknowledge for us where you are coming in from. And if you want to tell us who you're affiliated with, or if you're just yourself, that's fine too. Helps us to be able to know who's tuning in and where what your particular sectoral background is. So if you've got a minute to do that. Toronto is Canadian Urban Institute is a national pan-Canada thing, but it's based in Toronto. That at least the head office is. That happens to be where I am, as I was lamenting the humidity, which is the traditional territory of a number of Métis, First Nation and Indigenous peoples, specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa. And we are constantly trying to evaluate our relationship as settlers with the traditions and the history and the exclusion that urbanism has perpetuated and continues to struggle with. So we always say at the beginning that we're trying to find ways to do land acknowledgements that are more than just rote recitations of who actually owned this land and owns this land, but also how are we actually facing truth and reconciliation, both of those things. And one of the sessions that we're doing on housing is going to be specifically on the Indigenous challenges in Indigenous communities and the Indigenous perspective on housing. So we're very appreciative to have everybody here to talk about a very topical thing, which is what is the role of supply? And it's become a meme, I would say now. A year ago, I don't know if we were all preoccupied with whether it's about supply, but now every conversation seems to be about supply. Around my dinner table behind me last night, it was all about people saying, people not from our world either, not from the city building world particularly, preoccupied with supply. So this has seized the imagination and I think the conscience of people engaged in city life, and whether they're setting policy or they're experiencing this, if they're experiencing homelessness, or they have friends or family who are, or they have children, they're not quite sure where their kids are going to live, all that kind of thing. It seems to be a resonant conversation and it's become even a meme. So here we are to start our sessions on where we are in housing at an extraordinarily tumultuous time, with interest rates changing and governments at each level grappling with this. And so we're appreciative to have joining us 4 folks who are going to speak very specifically about their particular perspective on supply and the role that supply plays in addressing this fundamental challenge. So I'm going to ask them to turn their cameras on. And as you know, as is our practice here at CityTalk, we put people's bios in the chat. So you'll be able to hear more about them. And I'm going to start early by just asking them to give us a bit of a thumbnail about what their particular vantage point is around this. And then once they've each done that, then we'll have a conversation amongst us. And I threatened to go west to east. And so I'm going to start with Kira, because you get rewarded, Kira, because you're on your first cup of coffee. And Kira's joining us. Well, actually, Kira, why don't each of you identify where you're joining from? And I'll start with you, Kira. So over to you, go.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'm coming to all of you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, commonly known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I've been working in the affordable housing sector for, about 25 years now. I guess these lines under my eyes prove that. And about 15 years ago, we started to do some deep insights gathering into the issue of supply. And I guess what I would offer to open the conversation up is that, in those early days, we found that supply was happening in one of 2 ways. The first way was through government programs when we just had them through our provincial housing agency, which we refer to as BC Housing. So BC Housing still had funding programs back when the federal government was out of the housing supply program. And so housing would get supplied through that, or it would get supplied through negotiations of community amenity contributions through rezonings or development permissions that were being brokered between municipalities and market developers. But in both of those transactions, we saw a player missing from the program, and that player was the not-for-profit housing operators who ultimately then received those buildings and continued to operate them, sometimes under fixed-term operating agreements, and more rarely under an ownership model. And so when we discovered that kind of gap in the system, we turned our focus, when I worked at Van City Credit Union, to designing a program that specifically positioned community housing providers to be the delivery agent of choice for all affordable housing that got built in Canada. And I just want to paint this future imaginary for you. Imagine if all of the investment that is now coming from the federal government, that continues to come from the provincial government, all of the assets that are secured through community amenity contributions and other negotiations between developers and municipalities, imagine if all of that resource went into stabilizing the balance sheets of not-for-profit housing operators, preferably actually developers, asset managers, and property managers structured as not-for-profits. The advantage of that being that they can then, into the future, leverage those balance sheets. So borrow against a much more robust set of assets than what we currently understand for not-for-profit financial statements. In that model, there does come a time in the future when the need for the kind of subsidy that we're doing right now lowers and probably stabilizes, so that government can focus where personally I think they should be focused, which is delivering housing for those most vulnerable in our communities, and targeting all of our taxpayer dollars rather than into the whole breadth of affordable housing, from deep core need housing all the way through to barely below market affordable rental. Instead of trying to attack every stage along that continuum, imagine instead if we could target it on the most vulnerable, because we've empowered and stabilized the balance sheets of our not-for-profit housing developers so that they can actually just go to any bank like any other developer does to finance into the future. That doesn't happen right now in Canada, but it does happen as best practices in other cities. So this isn't a new idea. It's practiced and well understood for decades in cities like Vienna, Singapore. It used to be Hong Kong. I can't speak to what happened when they reverted back into the Chinese government, but there are examples of this from around the world. And the last thing I'll say, Mary, is, and I think I said this to you many months ago, but out of all of the things that we've been trying to solve the affordable housing supply problem in our country, this is the one thing we haven't tried in earnest yet. So I feel like the fact that that is the one thing we haven't tried makes it a very compelling thing to try in the age of innovation for our nation.
It's interesting to focus, as you're suggesting, on, instead of dickering about whether supply is a crisis or not, saying, well, why don't we build the capacity of a particular sector that we think can nimbly respond and create more? So it's a very interesting point. And also the balance sheet piece. I'm sure there are economists in our midst who are going to throw some comments in about this, about who can carry the balance sheet and not. And I know that Alan Broadbent from Maytree has been saying, why isn't the federal government why aren't they getting back into actually building and owning housing and then carried on their balance sheet? So I'll expect people with a finer knowledge about bookkeeping and ledgers to weigh in on this in the chat. But thanks, Kira. We'll come back to you. Let's stay in the West. Lillian, let's go to you next in terms of your perspective, and then we'll come east to the two folks that are in steamy Toronto. Go ahead. And thanks for also, just a reminder, when you're putting stuff into the chat, folks, figure that little toggle switch to say everyone, not just hosts and panelists. Let's make sure everybody sees the intelligence you are offering in the chat. Okay, Lillian, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody from Vancouver. I'm coming to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, otherwise known as Vancouver. Thanks for having me bringing a community housing sector perspective. And some of the things I'm probably going to touch on that Kira already touched on as well. But, from our perspective, why are we interested in this? Obviously, Entre Nous Femmes Housing Society, we're a charitable nonprofit. We provide affordable housing to women, single parent families, seniors, and people with disabilities. And it actually started 35 years ago because a group of single mothers decided that they could not find housing for folks like themselves, and they decided to actually create an organization to create that affordable housing. So 35 years later, we are across 11 properties and across 4 municipalities in Metro Vancouver. And so what we're seeing is that there is still a significant need for particular groups of folks, especially in that core housing need. And going back to that question about supply, obviously we're interested in growing the nonprofit sector to provide more affordable housing, similar to what Kira had said. But I think historically, if supply, if the answer was just supply and the market can just supply the diversity of housing for Canadians, historically the data doesn't substantiate that, right? So from the nonprofit housing sector perspective, there was a significant federal and provincial investment in social housing in the 60s all the way to 1990s. At that point in time, 14% of all new homes were actually social housing at that time. When the federal government de-invested in that, actually in the mid 1990s to now, we only see actually growth of 1% in social housing. So that tells you that the market isn't going to supply a certain type of housing unless it's a response to profits and different things. And so you cannot rely on the market solely to do that. And I think that's definitely where the nonprofit housing sector comes in. Currently in Canada, we have 13% of our population are actually in core housing need. And what core housing need means is that 13% of Canadians cannot find affordable housing that are adequate to their household size and suitable for their needs. Right now, we only have 6% of Canada's housing that is social housing and co-op housing. So we actually need to double the amount of social and co-op housing in order to actually meet that core need. So, I'll probably talk a little bit about that as you do your further questions, but certainly we're seeing that, supply isn't about, housing is getting unaffordable to everybody. And I've heard that term widely used, right? It's hitting middle income folks as well as vulnerable folks. Mm-hmm. However, we do need to look at the supply and look at the particular type of supply. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're not actually meeting the needs of Canadians, especially that 13%. You're not creating affordability for middle income earners either if policies and funding programs are just very generalized. You do need to disaggregate the data to ensure that we have equitable access to housing in Canada.
I mean, this is one of the challenges about, and I'm going to come to you next, Murtaza, because you have books behind you, which means you must be very thoughtful about this, about what the data tells us, but also, one of the challenges we've got, I think, those of us that are in this realm, is where should we be focusing our energies and where should the resources be focused? And Akira made a case for focusing in the not-for-profit sector, build the not-for-profit development community to build more housing. Lillian, you're saying those in core housing need, we haven't been building social housing in 3 decades. What's going on? Could we alleviate the pressure if we invested there? Would that be it? I want to come next to you at the now newly named Metropolitan University. What's your perspective? And then Ian will go to you last. So go ahead, Murtaza.
Thank you. I teach in the Department of Real Estate Management at the Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm currently based in Mississauga right now. And I've been studying this housing supply since 1996. In the Canadian context. And if I remember correctly, it was just myself and Mike Buzelli, who's now a professor at Western University, who actually studied housing supply as focus of their doctoral dissertations. And my reason for studying supply, and as early as in mid-90s, was that the planning profession, I found, had a pejorative view of home builders of the supply sector. And it was never seen as people who were providing new housing and shelter for Canadians. And the discourse hasn't changed over the last 30 years, as far as I have reviewed documents and literature. So my own focus has been on supply primarily because the data that we have, it's the same data that everyone has, suggests that we forgot to build enough housing. And I'll put some numbers in place, in perspective. In the early 70s in Canada, we were building something like 12,000 new homes per million people. So that's early 1970s, 12,000 new homes per million people. By mid 90s, that number went down to about 6,000 or 4,000 new homes per million people. And now it's between 5,000 to 6,000 new homes. So you could effectively see that the rate of construction since the 1970s has declined significantly. So we continue to grow in population, primarily because of immigration, but our rate of new housing construction has declined. At the same time, we found every other excuse other than supply to say demand is a problem, foreign home buyers are the problems, money laundering is the problem, but we've never go and address the main issue that we have not been building enough housing. And of the housing that we have been building, most of it is multiple residential, that is low-rise and high-rise housing. And the supply of ground-oriented housing is a small proportion of the housing that we are building right now. So of the 280,000 new homes that we expect to build in this year, about 65,000 would be low-rise. The rest would be multiple residential units. So not only that we are not building enough, we are building a housing of the type that's not really suitable for young families. And at the same time, purpose-built rental housing, that is housing that provides the security of tenure, that also disappeared since the early 70s when the two changes were brought. One of them was the capital gains tax that was imposed also on purpose-built rental construction and housing without any indexing for inflation. So these are the issues. Some of them are structural, some of them are systematic, some of them could be easily fixed. What I hear from the panel is it's true. We have not built social housing over the years, but I think social housing is a responsibility of the state and the state should step forward. But we should not assume that independent landlords or businesses have the responsibility to provide social housing. They could be public-private partnerships. But what is the role, what continues to be and should be the role of the government should not be offloaded to others because the governments collect funds and taxes for this very purpose. And therefore, I do value and support that we should be building more social housing. No one should fear for security of tenure or affordability in Canada because there's so much wealth. But the right agencies and agents should be responsible for the provision and construction and maintenance of new housing. I am, the last point, a bit worried about increasing the portfolio of social housing and keeping it in the hands of the government. Someone who would go and visit a housing stock maintained by public sector would know that it is not maintained in a state of good order. Some of it is not even livable, and therefore we need extra measures, maybe the not-for-profit sector, to be able to keep these social housing dwellings in a state of good repair so that people can live safely there. Thank you.
Thank you. And listen, I appreciate your point that you've been at it since you did your PhD. So thanks for your steadfast vigilance about tracking this issue. One of the things we've noticed at CUI, and we've asked some of our colleagues about this, is it seems as if, as you suggest, in the 70s, something happened in Canada and we dropped our level of focus. And so there haven't been as many academics tracking this as maybe we would have needed to. And so you're carrying that banner forward, and we appreciate you doing it for that reason, to keep this discussion informed by evidence. And I want to come back to some of the points you make, but one of them that I'm really struck by, and which we notice, is there tends to be a lot of blaming on this, around this topic, and a lot of people blaming other orders of government, or as you suggested, a real lack of trust in the development sector. And similarly, what we hear are lots of people who are going to blame municipal government. And it just seems to be the order of the day to just blame somebody, as opposed to actually finding what our collective way forward is. So Ian, I'm going to come to you next. You come from the not-for-profit sector, obviously, but you also just finished a stint with the provincial government's task force. So I'm interested your perspective from your own professional life, but also this task force you've just completed, or maybe it's still going on, but that you were sitting on. Thanks.
Yeah, so as you said, I come at this from a few directions. So I'm CEO of Habitat for Humanity, Greater Toronto area. And so wearing that hat, globally, our mission is about supply. We started more than 40 years ago in the United States, out of a view that, everyone in the world should have an adequate, decent, safe place to live. And we don't have that. So that we come from this, just this is very personal for us at a habitat level. We're entirely about the adequacy of people having a place to live. And for us in particular, not just a place to live, but we're an ownership model. So being able to use that adequate place to raise your family as also a place to build generational wealth, and therefore the possibility of the next generation doing even better. And not surprisingly, as people would anticipate, as housing prices have gone up at ever increasing rates, a challenge for us is who we are serving has also changed. So we are absolutely now serving some families who 10 years ago could have been able to buy a house on their own, but cannot today. So that's part of my motivation around, supply and this issue. Then, as Mary said, I had the opportunity to probably spend about 50% of my time exclusively thinking about supply during the month of December, January, and February as one of the members of this Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force, which was unapologetically and by mandate focused on supply, not out of a view that supply is the only solution, because it has to be part of a bigger portfolio, but it's a critical solution. And Murtaza referred to, some of the stats, and I have a feeling everyone listening to this webinar knows, we're last out of the G7 countries in terms of the number of homes we have for our population. And we are incredibly slow at building homes. It takes 3 times longer to build a home to get a building permit here in Canada than in the US, 4 times as long in Finland in Denmark. So there's lots of issues here, and wearing that hat of the Housing Task Force, we were quite intentionally very bold, in what we laid out for the Ontario government, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of the themes in that. I would also say, for me, so I have the habitat perspective, I have a task force perspective. I think for all of us, this is very personal as well. I'm ending my 50s, and had the opportunity to buy a home in the mid-90s in Toronto for $254,000, and had housing prices in the subsequent 20 years it grown at the same rate that they did in the previous, that house would be $428,000 today. But it's a $1.7 million home. And it's just, so as we all know, this is not fair. This does not lead us to productivity for people in their daily lives today, at home, at work, at school. And it definitely isn't leading us in the direction of the kind of country we need to be from a prosperity, inclusion, fairness. So lots of stuff I'd love to talk about. I think people have touched on, and I'm keen to get back to the right kind of supply is a super important part of this conversation. And of course, what can governments do? But honestly, what can all of us on this call? What more can we do? So Mary, I'll take it back to you, but lots of places I'm keen to continue to pursue.
Sometimes City Talk feels like a broadcast, back to you in the studio. Let's all put our mics on so we can have at it, and let's have a bit of a bun fight. And the chat's blowing up, as it often does, with people asking really good questions, which I'll feed into you. And I'm hoping that just because we've lost Murtaza on the video doesn't mean he's left. Is he still? Are you still there? Oh, you're there. Good. Okay.
I'm here.
You're allowed to turn your camera off. I had to briefly because I was dealing with a dog chewing something that they shouldn't be chewing. But here's the interesting thing for me. I mean, I'm in your demographic, a little older than you, Ian, and I am struck by what you're suggesting. But I remember when I was in my 20s and late 20s and 30s, it was hard for me to buy a house in Toronto, actually. And I bought outside first and then came in, but nowhere near what it is now. But one of the things that I think about is a lot of people rely on their residence as their retirement. And so there's a whole constituency of Canadians whose interest is being served by the growing value of our homes, so it's very difficult to try to, as you suggest, if someone came to you and said, well, Ian, you know what, the real value of your house is going to be $475,000, you'd like chief intake of breath, and you'd say, well, how am I going to retire, etc. So I know this is the dilemma, is that we could talk about it at these very, very macro levels, but let's try to talk very specifically about this. What do you think the key interventions should be if we're agreed that the numbers that Murtaza just rolled through, which are phenomenal, that we are not producing the numbers of physical dwellings that we used to, even with the population growing. Kira, your first suggestion is let's put some money and build a proper nonprofit sector or a vibrant nonprofit sector. Some people in the chat are asking about that because BC has done that. You have a more vibrant not-for-profit sector than the rest of us seem to. Do you, and maybe it's not a simple answer. Maybe it's 5 things, but let's see if we could come up with 5 amongst you guys. The 5 things that you think would boost supply. Go ahead, Kira.
Well, just to be clear, I wouldn't disagree with anything that anybody else has said. I
Right.
think it should be focusing on the right supply by the right entities. And so the reason why I kind of went like this when you were saying that BC has, built up a significant not-for-profit asset base is that it's constrained. So there are these rules and regulations that come along with financing from BC Housing that limit the not-for-profit's ability to leverage the value of their asset for
In
the
a good way?
25 years. No,
In a good way, in a bad way. Okay. But you just,
because
but you have more of a sector. Some parts of the country have virtually 2 not-for-profit housing developers, and that's it. At least you have a sector, but I hear you. Keep going.
right. So then the second piece about, so you adequately invest, channel that financing in a way that allows the not-for-profit sector to act and feel like the market developers, like the market development sector does, but with a motivation towards mission, not margin.
What would that look like? Tell me what that would look like if you didn't have the impediment.
Yeah, I'll tell you a story.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, we had the Vienna model was brought to the Museum of Vancouver as part of the City of Vancouver's housing strategy conversation. So it's a nice big planning engagement. And so when I was working at Van City still at that time, we had a whole bunch of folks from Vienna come into our head office on the top floor and talk about it. And one of our lenders asked one of the not-for-profit real estate developers from Vienna, how do you secure a loan when you're developing a new project? And she looked at him and she said, I don't think I understand your question. What do you mean secure the loan? And he's like, well, how do we as a lender know that you're good for it if we lend you 50 million euros to develop a new project somewhere in downtown Vienna? And she looked at him and she said, we have a $500 billion balance sheet. What more security could you possibly need?
So the government is putting its balance sheet towards, somehow the rules enable that so that a modest not-for-profit developer does not have to supply their own balance sheet. That's a
well, it's not the government supplying the balance sheet. What it was government allocating public land way back in the day to not-for-profit ownership. So it wasn't retained as ownership by government. It was actually transferred to the not-for-profit sector. So they owned the land. And they own the asset. And just like, if you want to refinance your mortgage to buy a second home in Muskoka, not-for-profits can do that. But instead of buying a second home to drink pink martinis, they can buy a second property to grow the number of homes that they are managing. So and to the point around vulnerable housing, the more homes that they have across a broad range, the more opportunity they have to cross subsidize with higher rents from one place to lower rents in another.
So how, Lillian, I see your hand up, but Kira, before we leave you, so how would you operationalize that? I mean, I think you're right. The Vienna person just thought you guys were crazy asking the question, but how do we do it now? Because we haven't had that massive land transfer that went, what would you do now to get more land into those hands so they would have the balance sheet?
Exactly that. Transfer land to not-for-profits and adequately invest in them to build up their capacity to be effective, comparably effective property developers and asset managers. And if you adequately invest in them, you can pay their staff enough that market developers might want to move, especially some of the senior development managers who right now are just making money for the owner. They still get to bag the deal. And if they can do it and supply housing for Canadians, I think, well, in fact, I know that there are many people who would want to make that switch. They just need to get paid enough.
So first radical idea is we're going to build a balance sheet of not-for-profit housing developers so that they can actually do their work and finances they require. And Mark Richardson saying, what about land trusts? Good point, Mark. Maybe a land trust is the vehicle to get this land over. Lillian, you had your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit developer and we've been going through different funding cycles, et cetera. And obviously we can't talk about affordable housing without talking about capital investment. from federal, provincial, and municipal governments. So I'll give you an example here in BC. In 2021, the BC Housing, we have a subsidized program called Community Housing Fund. It provides capital investments. It also provides an operating subsidies. So in 2021, 13,000 units applied to receive this funding. Only 2,600 were actually approved. So that's about 20% of all applications. So
Right.
this tells me a couple of things. One, when you're asking for supply and building more supply, the community housing sector in BC is answering that call, right? So in BC, actually, we have a deficit we need about 11,000 units to be built every year to actually meet the demand of social housing core needs and actually middle income housing. So, if there was actually enough funding, let's say we funded all 13,000, we would actually be able to keep up with that demand and actually be able to do that.
Where should that money come from, Lillian?
Yeah, I would say currently we need more capital investment from federal government. So through their CMHC program, the capital investments currently there are actually very small. They will provide you with very good loan terms, so long amortizations, 50 years, and generally a lower interest rate. However, as we're seeing right now, when the Bank of Canada raises interest rates, it's across the board. It affects all sectors. And that certainly affects the nonprofit sector in order to actually get the financing that Kira is talking about and actually make the project work. The cost of borrowing right now is extremely expensive to the point where it's almost impossible to provide rents that are probably about 50% below or 30% below market, right? The nonprofit sector has to actually make that up. And that's really difficult. So for me, the first one, and we actually just recently had a roundtable with a number of nonprofit housing providers in the Lower Mainland, and these things came up, right? So in terms of providing more capital contributions, CMHC currently has revamped their co-investment contribution program to about $50,000 to $100,000 a door. That is definitely needed, and we actually need more. In terms of equity for these projects to actually work to create maybe at least a 30% affordability or even more, you're looking at like 30, you're only be able to debt service through your rental revenue, maybe 30%, maybe 20%. If you're looking at really affordable rents, maybe 10% only. So you need actual capital investments in order to actually create that affordability in the type of housing that we're doing. The other big thing is we need to buffer the nonprofit sector if we're going to build in this current environment in the next 5 years, buffer them from the interest rates increase. So we're advocating for CMHC to actually cap their interest rates for their programs at maybe 2%, 2.5%, and consider that as an investment back into the sector, not as a loss, right?
Yeah.
You need that investment to actually make that work. And then Kira talked a little bit about, can we acquire more lands and things like that. Here in BC, we've been advocating for at least a $500 million acquisition fund. So that enables the nonprofit sector to actually purchase existing rental properties that are aging and are actually being lost and being redeveloped into market housing. This enables the nonprofit sector to do some land assemblies and actually, really extract the most out of their properties in order to provide greater affordability. But we certainly, in the sector, nonprofits and charities don't have a bunch of cash just kind of lying around. Right? We operate on a break-even basis. That's what you're required to do as a charity to maintain your charitable status. But there is a real need for capital in the sector in order to actually do that investment, create more housing, and actually get these units built. So I would love to see all 13,000 of those units to be approved each year and every year. If we had that, we're actually going to keep up and actually provide that housing for affordable housing for many, many more individuals and families.
Right. So in addition to these four smart folks, we've got, I can see on the chat, we've got 300 people here on this call. Many of you, the ones that are who are sharing your names, I can see who you are. These are people, you have been engaged in this sector trying to solve this Gordian knot for 3 decades, some of you, some more recently, but surely to goodness amongst us, we can figure out what's the solution going forward. And what I always get frustrated by is if we just collectively lament the problem, can we move ourselves to the solution? So Lillian, you're talking about money. How do we get money? And I'm wondering, Murtaza, could you comment on this? Like, is there a way we all think, oh, well, it's CMHC? Is it pension funds? Is it some other kind of mechanism to get capital. Kira is working on the sort of social, on the innovation side with private philanthropy. Like, there is money in the Canadian system. Can we get it to where it needs to go to get us to produce the units we need? Murtaza, what do you think?
Sure. I think first, I would like to make a point that you have to divide this problem into at least two segments.
Okay.
One is the social housing, and one is the housing supply for the market supplied housing. And the conversation that we are having so far is confined to the supply of social housing, that's non-market housing. And the way I see it, the bigger problem is the supply of market-based housing, which we have not been building. And there is a filtering mechanism that happens in the housing markets that you supply housing. At any level of sophistication or price level, there is a filtering mechanism that happens. It's better to supply at the mid or lower end of the market, but at least there's a filtering mechanism. So if we continue to talk about the social housing, I think you will miss the 85 to 90% of the supply issue on hand, which is market-based housing that people don't have.
But Murtaza, can you talk about both and? Because I hear you, and I know that in the sector, there is a very animated advocacy constituency that are concerned about our most vulnerable, who experience this in a really profound way. But is there a way for us to have this conversation in tandem? And I guess one of the questions you'll see on the chat is people don't have a lot of trust that the market is actually creating the range of housing choice that it needs to. So I guess that would be a question for you as somebody watching the market. Is there a way for the market to build a broader variety to meet a broader constituency of need?
So again, the market, I believe, is providing the kind of housing being demanded.
By some people.
By majority, I would say. When you have 670,000 homes being sold, resale market in 2021, and about 200,000 new homes being bought, which means that about 1 million Canadians were busy buying homes last year, and about 550,000 the year before, and including about 150 to 200,000 new homes that were bought in 2020 or 2021. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a market that is functioning. We cannot ignore the bigger picture, but let me come back to the more important question that you asked, is to where the money should come from, could come from for social housing. I firmly believe that social housing is a serious challenge for us, and we need to invest more. And the governments are doing it to some extent. Can pension funds be involved in it? The challenge is that even for market-based rental housing, when you have rent controls that limit or make it uncertain the future cash flows for investments, then investors would be very wary of it, that if you invest in, let's say, forget about even social housing, market-based rental housing, and then you have rent control systems that that signal to the developer that you can invest money, but your future cash flows are uncertain because of these regulations, then you would see that money would not go into that direction. So what is the role of the state in that case? Whatever disadvantages that happen because of these uncertainties in future cash flows, those certainties could be provided by the government so that private capital could come in. My firm belief is that this supply issue cannot be resolved by the governments alone. This supply issue would only be resolved by a major influx of private sector involvement. And I say this because when I study the German housing market, especially after the war, many people are quite quick to mention that, look at Germany, there are a lot of people rent there. But what they fail to see is how that German housing market came about after the Second World War. And that is through the involvement of the private sector, that the government provided certain guarantees, and the private sector was involved in building those purpose-built rental housing and others. So the government's role should be not only to provide capital, but create the environments in which those guarantees for future cash flows could be created, so that the risk is spread and it's not solely on the shoulders of lenders the risk has to be borne by the government and the larger taxpayer.
Well, and that's what Lillian's saying. I mean, she needs a buffer with these rising interest rates. One of the things I forgot to say at the beginning is that we publish the chats for these sessions, and thank goodness we do, because honestly, the chat is blowing up, which is fantastic. And there are many, many people on this chat that have been in this, as I say, for many years and have lots of good solutions. So don't hold back, folks. Get your ideas and thoughts and responses into the chat in addition to what we're talking about here. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep coming at this from the government side, or from the market and government side. Because I am with Murtaza on the point that we have to be careful here, that we're not exclusively focused on social housing. And what I will also say is, and as we all recognize, that, yeah, the reality is the market will not necessarily behave rationally in terms of the full spectrum of social needs. And that is where governments come in. And so what can the government do to cause the market to behave more rationally and in the process create benefit for those of us that are delivering social and affordable housing? So the first is to make housing a priority. Because I haven't been in housing for my whole career. I've been in it for about 10 years. And what has been striking to me as a realization when we're trying to get planning approvals is, oh, look, we're last behind considerations around traffic, considerations around heritage, et cetera. And so, one of the things that the task force report was saying, first of all, in Ontario, change the Planning Act. So it is really clear that when, from a planning approvals perspective, housing and housing in a term of density around transit corridors, et cetera, is a priority. So there's, number one of just
How would you do?
Sorry, let me then keep going, because then
Okay.
the next thing I would say is also changing the balance of power. And this again is the theme of our housing policy, at least in the province of Ontario, is disproportionately tilted towards people like me who already own a home. So government, and again, this is where the notion of the province in Ontario, the province in particular, can be the adult in the room and depoliticize some of what happens on the ground at the municipal level. So the notion of the province setting the framework for things like as of right housing. So, part of that, of course, is exclusionary zoning. There's no reason my neighborhood, shouldn't have, multiple triplexes, multiple mid-rise in it. And the province can set that framework. As part of as of right, the province can make it as of right everywhere in this province for there to be for multi-unit dwellings, so that I can't go to a community meeting protesting a quote rooming house. If it's made as of right, it is, why shouldn't we have opportunities for multi-tenant housing in all of our communities? So there's some of those things, in the task force report, we also talked about the Ontario Land Tribunal, that used to be the OMB, again, disproportionately makes the bar very low for people to protest developments that are out there. And that benefits people who are already established. It disadvantages people who don't already have their homes. So there's a number of these kind of framework things that government really can do. And I think I want to then, Mary, just also jump to what gets built. And maybe, Murtaza, this is where I might beg to differ somewhat, is I'm not convinced that what's getting built right now is the right thing to get built, not just for families today, but for the sustainability for transit, environment, food supply, et cetera. So I hear, often the developers say, we need more, greenfield development for ground-related single homes. And it's because they say that's what the market wants. Yep. That's what the market wants. The market would also like to be able to do, like, I'd love to do fireworks in my backyard on a long weekend. And there's reasons why that's not the right thing. So I think the notion is the province can set a firmer framework around what gets built when we expand our urban boundaries. Again, so apologies for the Ontario focus. In the province of Ontario, only 5% of our land is still zoned for agricultural. So, talk to Ukraine, watch global food supply issues because of what's happening in Ukraine right now. We have to think about food supply. We need to think about transit. We need to think about environment, and we need to shift what home looks and feels like for future generations in the communities that exist today and the communities we're building for the future.
So Ian, I just want to push back a bit, and then I'm going to go to Lillian, who put her hand up there. If we're saying that it takes too long. This is the lament. You said it in your opening remarks.
Sure,
It takes
yeah.
too long. It takes too long. And I don't know whether building permits is the same as actually getting something gone, because in fact, lots of municipalities have got lots of permits that they've approved and the development still isn't happening. But in that framework where we're already lamenting it's too long, and at the same time you're saying, but we need to be building along transit lines, we need to be building sustainably, we need to not be consuming farmland, to constrain development to the market that Murtaza says is busy doing its thing, that does slow things down. So how do we square that, you know? And this is the anxiety people have, is that if we lift all these rules and we say, have at it, then all hell's going to break loose and we're going to lose the quality of our neighborhoods and we're going to lose more green space. Go ahead, Murtaza. But actually, Lillian had her hand up. So I'm going to go Lillian first, then Murtaza. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I guess a bit connected, because going back to, you know, real estate development is a capital intensive endeavor. So you need that capital to do. And I want to go back to a little bit about the pension funds. Okay. So, you know, the market is producing products because the market wants it. So I guess I would reframe that. It's like, what if the pension funds, which actually have a significant amount of cash, and that includes REITs, right? They need to park their money somewhere to have investments. I'm going to give you an example in BC, and actually someone mentioned this in an Ontario example as well. So in BC, we have a very large pension fund management company. They manage 11 public sector pension funds. Right. That includes your municipal workers, teachers, universities, etc. They own a real estate company because that's how they're going to invest their dollars. That real estate company owns a very large mall that's currently being redeveloped. It's called Oak Ridge. It's in the west side of Vancouver. The land values are extremely high, and they're going to redevelop that into about 3,300 units of both strata and rental housing. So I think to Martha's, you know, this is both market, and there's also some about 290 social housing units there as well. So they're trying to do both. So that social housing component with, you know, some rental housing, it's about 9% of that affordable housing to provide on this property. Typically in other municipalities, we're seeing inclusionary policies up to at least 20%. So it kind of begs to question, why aren't we extracting a bit more out of this significant development? They're building actually luxury, like these are going to be quite expensive condos that are going to be sold. So why can't we extract more? And, you know, funny enough, the pension plan, the members of this pension plan are the very same ones that are saying that teachers cannot live in the community.
Who want to actually,
yeah, right? Firefighters cannot do that. So the planners that are actually writing housing policy and creating, you know, policies for creating more affordable housing or trying to adjust with the market, they're also not able to afford, but their very own pension funds are actually creating, basically continuing to create housing as a commodity, right? We're financializing a commodity, as Ian said, you know, you're raising property prices, you're using it to, you know, have a nest egg after you retire. But it's ironic that, you know, given that there is supposed to be an environmental and, you know, ESG kind of focus to those pension funds, would it not be, you know, what would the world look like if those pension funds were able to then create a goal that they're going to invest in affordable housing, into housing that their members can actually live in, right?
So listen, all those of you listening who work for a pension fund or who are a beneficiary of the pension fund, come into the chat and give us some insight here about how we can move this money differently. Murtaza and then Kira, go ahead.
I think the issue should be scale. If we were to focus on pilot projects, 500 units here, 1,000 units there, then we'll realize that we have been doing that successfully for the past 50 years. What we haven't done is supplying housing on scale. Mm-hmm. That is to build maybe 400,000 to 500,000 dwelling units a year for several years consistently in Canada. That hasn't happened. And once that happens, then the supply skeptics can come in if their desirable outcomes are not reached.
But how are you going to get to that? How are you going to get that quantum? I mean, short of the military coming in, and we'll all hate what they build. Like, even our military probably couldn't do it. Like, how do you get?
We have 40,000 active forces. They certainly
don't do it. I know, but you know what I'm getting at. Like, how do we? I hear the economist argument, we've got to get to scale, but how? Is it that we don't have enough of those pilot projects? Do we need
So
more
let's
money?
look at the barriers, and some of the barriers could be removed without putting much money into it. You have NIMBYs, not in my backyard, as of right, zoning would take it. You have NIMTOs. These are the councillors who said, not in my term of office. It's a great plan, 5-story building. NIMTOs.
So these, you both you and Ian are making the case, the anti-subsidiarity case, which is basically bump it upstairs and make it as of right, so that it's not.
So NIMTOs are councillors who are voted in by existing voters who are homeowners, and they would oppose such developments of high rise. Remember, builders are fighting for density. They're not saying let us build lower density or less floors. They spend considerable amount of time trying to add 2, 3 or more floors to their projects. So we have designed a system that is fighting the builders and developers in providing density. The other thing is sometimes we put restraints thinking things would work, and that's basically the disconnect between housing and transportation systems. Now, being a transportation engineer, I know a little thing or two about what happens with transportation, and especially transit systems. Take the example of Shepherd Subway extension in Toronto, $1 billion spent, and now, even that you take the time before COVID, there were fewer people riding some of those stations than the bus routes, the number of passengers carried on numerous bus routes in Toronto, which meant that even after you provide public transit of higher order, that is subway systems, allow people to live nearby by building high rises, still there is a disconnect that people won't use that service. So just by restricting, forcing builders and others to concentrate buildings in certain areas of certain types, we restrict the supply through our planning regulations for assumed benefits that we know have not happened, at least in the case of Shepherd Subway. So there has to be certain realism behind our policy that when we are restricting people from supplying for certain reasons, those reasons should be sound and based on logic and data.
Ian and then Kira.
I'll stand by for Kira. Thanks. I'll come back after Kira.
Go ahead, Kira.
Thanks, Ian. So just a couple of things. First of all, I think it's false binary to say that there is social housing and then there is market housing. I think we are more sophisticated now than that, and we understand that there is a housing continuum, and that housing continuum has and I see some of the folks in the chat talking about affordable home ownership being part of that housing continuum. I would say that even in the rental market, there are different target markets that we can that we should be distinguishing. So this idea that it's either social housing or market housing, I think, is a false binary that doesn't get us to the nuanced and sophisticated kind of policy conversation that I think we ought to be having right now. That's my first point. The second point, when it comes to where this money comes from, I think, this idea that rent controls create uncertainty, I would argue that it's exactly the opposite. Rent controls guarantee that you're going to get a certain amount of rent every month from a renter. And that amount of money is going to be sustaining your cash flow over the long haul. Granted, it might not be as much money as you get in a free market, but it is still a certain, there's more certainty and arguably less risk investing in an affordable housing project than there is in investing in a market housing project. So, and we can have that debate some other time if you want to, Marzita.
But the other point, but the point would be that if you've got a robust not-for-profit sector that's mission-based, it could be building rental and let the market 100%. Go crazy. And
that's exactly it.
Right. Right.
That's exactly it. And then my last point was just going to be, a lot of the conversation, like I've been in lots of conversations like this over the years. We often talk about housing policy as if this is something that CMHC ought to do, or in BC that BC Housing ought to do. We don't often talk about finance policy. And I would argue that through OSFI or through, in British Columbia, the BC Financial Services Association, that we could be getting much more sophisticated about regulating the amount of financing and the cost of financing, to Lillian's point, that we make available to not-for-profit real estate developers, and start differentiating the kind of financial products that we're offering to the market and the kind of financial products that we're offering to the non-market housing developers. And so CMHC right now, Lillian gave the case study of BC Housing. The reason why CHF was only able to finance a certain amount is because they have a limited pool that they draw from, and they're basically competing with financial institutions right now. And frankly, I think that's kind of dumb. I think instead we could be encouraging and even, I'll say it, mandating financial institutions. You could start with credit unions because you're probably a little bit more working with the willing and that kind of financial institution. But start with financial institutions and say, you know what, you have to allocate a certain amount of your book to affordable housing delivery. And yes, it can be guaranteed. And that was a point that I think Mertzada made. You know, let's start getting more sophisticated with our financial policy instead of saying that you know, supply is only enabled through what CMHC can do through its own programs.
So this would be through the Ministry of Finance, and it would be provincially and federally, and it would affect the rules of the game in terms of those investors. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, so a few things. Number one, absolutely, there's a lot we can and should be doing on monetary policy, and a great conversation for another panel, that exclusively. I want to pick up, Kira, what you said of just, it is a continuum. There are and should be blurry boundaries between what we think of as affordable housing and quote market housing. Something that has become really clear to us at Habitat for Humanity is because of the disappearance, and Lillian quoted some stats, of truly affordable housing. We've actually changed our model in the Greater Toronto Area so that the appreciation sharing with the family they're getting appreciation that more fully approximates inflation, putting us in a position to always be buying these homes back as families are ready to move to market housing. And what that means is being able to keep these enclaves of affordability in our communities. And I do think that notion, as we talk about affordable housing, of when we make these commitments to affordable housing, how do we keep it affordable? The quid pro quo on the government side is therefore government fees associated with this housing we built. And we, by the way, spend about $150,000 per Habitat home in the GTA on government fees. Those fees should really not be incurred until and as such time as a unit moves into the market. So things about, let's get smart about when we are building affordable, how do we keep it that way? The place I think I want to end is just, the reminder for all of us. I know everyone on this call is already motivated, is already in the housing space, but I think there is more that we can do on emboldening our governments. There's great organizations now here in the GTA, like More Neighbors Toronto, piling on to the work they are doing of pushing back against NIMBYism. The BC-based Generation Squeeze, if people haven't heard of it, go to their website. They are doing fantastic work, analytic work and advocacy work on how do we change our landscape so it's going to work for the next generation. So I think it's just this notion of, for each of us on this call, okay, what next? What more can we do?
30 seconds to each of you on that. What next? What more can we do? And it has to be 30 seconds. Murtaza, you first.
My 2 cents would be that we should keep the binary between the social housing and market housing, and no one can do everything at the same time. Therefore, we should keep that. Secondly, the governments have a responsibility that they should be looking into by providing social housing and making sure that no one fears or is afraid of the security of shelter. At the same time, let's not create systematic hurdles in the way of builders, as the way we have constrained them over the past 5 decades. Allow them to do what they know the best and better than us, and that is to build housing. And we need to build a lot more than we have in the past 5 decades.
Okay, I think he just agreed with you, Lillian. I think he said, let's build some social, but not the market. Lillian, a really very, very fast closing word to you, and then to Kira. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think my closing is that I think we need to recognize that the impacts of housing unaffordability actually affects different groups differently. So if you're depending on your gender, your age, your household income, immigrant status, etc. And so I think that needs to be recognized in any policies that we're actually looking at, to make sure that we're actually creating equitable access to housing, because we cannot create, everybody is equal. No, not everybody is equal in our society. And we need to understand how we get to an equitable access to housing in Canada.
I mean, one size never fits all. Let's just say Kira to you, and then Ian, and then we're going to break. Go ahead, Kira.
Yeah, I think the topic of the conversation today is supply side solutions. So I would argue that where the opportunity to innovate is in positioning the not-for-profit or community housing sector to be the delivery agent of choice for all affordable housing, not just social housing. I don't agree with the binary nature of it because it limits then our ability to cross subsidize. That's my point.
Okay, Ian, last word to you.
Mary opened by referring to the traditional territories here in the GTA. One of those nations here in the GTA is the Haudenosaunee, and they have a principle called the 7 generations principle, which I will misstate somewhat, but it is the notion of we need to always look back 7 generations. What can we learn from the past? And we must look forward 7 generations to say, what are the decisions we're making today going to mean for the lived experience 7 generations down the road? And so I think for all of us getting better, even at looking through 2 generations ahead, when we make transit, housing, environmental, monetary policy decisions, we need to be informed by the wisdom of the Haudenosaunee when it comes to these conversations.
Lots at stake in this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really great beginning to this. As we always say, it's never the end, it's just the beginning. Next week, we're doing a session on encampments because summer is here and the tents are starting. And then the week after, we're going to do a report back on what we heard because CUI has been working with the National Housing Council, and many of you participated in talking about what has to happen to the National Housing Strategy. So listen, thanks very much for joining us. As you know, we'll post the chat, we'll post the video, and we'll post some takeaways. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again to Kira and Ian and Murtaza and Lillian. Thanks for joining us, gang, and everybody else. Bye.
Thank you very much.